Good morning. Welcome to our keynote presentation. We have three guests today. The title of the presentation is Towards an Israeli-Palestinian Settlement. My name is Guillermo de los Reyes. I'm a professor at the University of Houston and also member of the Policy Studies Organization. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our guest. And I will introduce our guest today for this session, and welcome also to our colleagues who meet from all over the world via Zoom with the new technologies and the post-COVID era that we need to deal with. That we had a little bit of technical problems at the beginning, but we solved them now. And it is my great pleasure to introduce first Mr. Alon Ben Meir, who is an expert on the Middle East politics and affairs, specializing in peace negotiations between Israel and the Arab states. And he's at New York University. Thank you very much for being here with us. Also, we have Khaled El-Jindi, Senior Fellow and Director of Programs on Palestine and Palestinian Israeli Affairs at the Middle East Institute. Thank you, Mr. Khaled. And last but not least, we have Lucy Kurzer-Elmbogen. Thank you. Director of the the Palestinian Territories and the Region Program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And we will have a conversation that will be led by Mr. Ben Meir on the relationship between Israel and Palestine. Thank you very much, and I leave you with it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Is it this way? Yeah, okay. It's been a sort of a lifetime for me, an effort to be looking into it, investigating and researching it, going back more than 40 years. As a matter of fact, I was mentioning to my friends, colleagues here, my PhD was on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And since then, I've been maintaining that the solution to the conflict will have to be based on the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. To me, there is no circumstance under which the Palestinian can be persuaded to abandon their aspiration for statehood. It just will not happen. No matter how much oppression they will endure, no matter how much longer the occupation will persist. That is, there is no way that they will give up on that basic right. The right being established going back all the way to 1947. The fact that they not accepted the partition plan then does not suggest that they lose their right to statehood. So, but this has been my position all these years. That hasn't changed. What has changed, however, is what's on the ground. That is, the fact that I've been looking at the ground and asked myself the question, these new facts have been established over the last many decades since the occupation began. What can be changed on the ground? What cannot be changed on the ground, provided, though, the principle of a two-state solution remain valid. That's the whole idea here. That is, unless the two-state solution the integrity of two-state solution is valid, there will be no solution. So I look at these realities on the ground and ask myself, okay, what can be changed? And based on that, establish some kind of framework that's going to work. Having looked into these realities, which I'll briefly talk about each of them, I also came to the realization that Jordan is going to have to be an integral part of a future solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the concept of confederation, that is Israeli-Palestinian Jordanian confederation. But this is not something that can be, but the three parties could sit down tomorrow, next month, or next year and say, well, this is what we're going to do, and agree on that kind of a solution. That is going to require considerable amount of process a process what I call of reconciliation. But let me begin briefly tell you what are these facts, in my view, cannot change and will determine the framework for peace between the two sides. Number one, the interspersed population. When you look at the demographically speaking, you have Israelis to the tune of 450,000 in the West Bank. There are 2,900,000 Palestinians. In Jerusalem, there are roughly 275,000 Israelis. That is East Jerusalem, and there are 300,000 Palestinians. This is a fact. It is a demographic that cannot be changed. In Jordan, nearly half, in fact, more than half of the Jordanian population is of Palestinian origin. And even though Gaza is separated, it's not, but today, even Gaza, even though the present circumstances, they depend on Israel for just about everything, and to some extent as well as Egypt, which means the demographic reality as it exists today, it will be nearly impossible to change because neither of the party can expel millions from their own territory. This isn't going to happen. So we have to live with that interspersed population. The second fact that determines the future is that national security. That is, when you look at the national security today, for all the parties involved, even under the present circumstances, Israel and the Palestinian Authority collaborate on many security matters, and certainly there is very close tight security between Israel and Jordan as well. So the nature of security, that is not going to change either. That is, three parties will have to continue to collaborate on all security matters under any circumstances. The third element that cannot be changed, that is the status of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is there are holy shrines for the Muslims, holy shrine of the Israelis, and certainly Jordan is a custodian of the Muslim shrines in Jerusalem. There is no way, in my view, that the status of Jerusalem as it stands today and the relationship of the three parties to Jerusalem can be modified short of catastrophic event or religious for that matter. So we have to factor in also the status of Jerusalem as such, where the three parties have interest or commitment, because we're talking now about religion, that it is not something that you can mitigate under any circumstances. Then comes the question of existing other realities and how do we deal with that? The question of Palestinian refugees, for example, that's a very important one. This is a major humanitarian issue that has been going on now since 1948, from the time Israel was created. And that, as some of you would know, the word Nakba, that is a catastrophe. And the Palestinian refugees has only worsened over the time. And whereas there were initially 750,000 or so that actually left Palestine, partly by Israel pushing them out, partly because they were called to leave. Now there are nearly 6 million Palestinian refugees, albeit many of them live in the West Bank. They live in Gaza. I consider them to be internally displaced, but they are nevertheless, they are refugees for that matter. So the right of return that the Palestinians have been calling and demanding all along, that is not going to happen, because under no circumstances will Israel accept millions of refugees going back, given the fact that Israel wants to maintain the national Jewish identity of the state. Moreover, throughout the various negotiations going back to Oslo Accord, 1993, 1994, and Camp David 2000, negotiations between 2007 and 2008 with Olmert, there was an agreement in principle that there would be 30, 40,000 Palestinians could go back under family reunification, but the vast majority would have to be resettled and or compensated. And that is remain the solution today. And in my view, there is no other solution other than resettlement and or compensation. The second element is the Israeli settlement. Again, this issue discussed between Israelis and the Palestinians in various negotiations, and there was always an agreement in principle that the three major blocks of Israeli settlement along the 1967 borders will have to stay in place. They house roughly 550,000 Israelis, 450,000 Israelis. And then in East Jerusalem, you have additional 270,000 Israelis. So the total roughly 750,000 Israelis in these various settlements. But the vast majority, 80% of the settlers, live along the original 1967 border. And they have to remain in place. And the Palestinian, all along, this authority Palestinian, have accepted this as a matter of principle, except that there's some 30, 40 small settlements scattered all over the West Bank. Some of these settlements will have to be removed, basically relocate settlers into either the larger settlement and or just go back to Israel. Again, will be compensated to do that. Again, I've had scores of conversations with many settlers, many of them for the proper compensation, they'll be more than happy to leave in order to create a contiguous landmass for a Palestinian state. So when you look at these now, I challenge Israelis, I challenge Palestinians, and I challenge anyone, and I ask them this simple question. Tell me how you're going to change these fundamentals. And honestly, nobody could tell me persuasively, this is what we can do, because this is reality that exists and will continue to exist. But the one thing we have to keep in mind, the current status quo, in my view, is totally and completely unsustainable. We have seen violence going on for many, many years now, but decades, but in recent months, the violence is being escalated in the West Bank in particular. That is, the Palestinian, at one point or another, will get to conclusion. They've got nothing left to lose. And when a nation, when people come to that conclusion, we've got nothing left to lose, I believe that is a question only of time when there's going to be massive explosion, massive conflict, violent conflict between the two sides. And I was just saying to my friends here, I think it's going to make the second intifada looks like a rehearsal. And the Israelis know that. Israelis know that. But then you have government in Israel, specifically the last one, which is probably is the most extremist. People use other words like a fascist government for that matter. As a government has zero interest in providing or allowing the Palestinian to have anything that resembles states. It is committed to further annexation of Palestinian land. It is committed to expanding of the settlement. And that is something, of course, if it's allowed to do so, that is going to further complicate the conflict between the two sides. And the resolution will be delayed the years, maybe more decades, but the fundamental I mentioned to you before are not going to change. They can only become more acute and need to be addressed. So why confederation then? That is, when I asked the Israelis under what circumstances you will make peace with the Palestinians, they said, this is going to be a long process. And I'm talking about the moderate Israelis, those from the center and left of center, like the Yesh Atid party, led by Lapid, and other parties from the left and left of center. As far as they are concerned, ultimately a Palestinian state will have to be created, but even them, they feel that that is obviously going to take a process because there is a profound distrust, profound hatred between the two sides, to a point where it is impossible for them just to sit down and find a solution and say, okay, this is what we're going to work with. That won't happen. So therefore, I'm suggesting a process of reconciliation that is people to people and government to government. But you need also a big brother, so to speak, to make sure that, in fact, if there is an agreement in principle, that following a process of reconciliation, a Palestinian state will be created, will have to be agreed upon in advance. But with the involvement of four major players. One is obviously Saudi Arabia. The other one in my mind has got to be obviously the United States. And one from the representing the EU, which has very keen and very good relations both with Israel and the Palestinians, which is Germany. And the fourth party will have to be Egypt. Egypt because of its proximity to Hamas, to the Gaza Strip. So these four the parties, and in my view, and again, I spoke to a high representative of all four governments, and they feel that it is obviously their participation, their input, their persuasion or sometimes pressure, whatever it might take, they will have to be the one who make sure that once they could sit down, they're going to make sure that this is of continuity. That things can happen in the middle. Things can explode. Something can go wrong. But you have to have this power to make sure that the status, that is a framework that we are working on, it is sustained. When I spoke to Jordanians, one of their main prerequisites said that we are open to this kind of discussion. However, we have to insist that a Palestinian independent state must be first created. And that's their main prerequisite. And so the Israelis as well feel the other way, that is, we will not be able to do so, that is, those from the center, as I said, and left of center, unless that Jordan become part of it, because as it is today, the three parties are working together, collaborating on many, many issues, on national security matter, about Jerusalem, trade, in all matters. They're still working together. So what is the concept of confederation that will make this possible? That is the collaboration between independent states, but they collaborate on matters of mutual interest. They will have a mutual interest in collaborating. Security is one, Jerusalem is another, trade and all of that. They need to collaborate. And of course, in my proposal, I'm also establishing a mechanism how to also deal with Jerusalem, given the fact that Palestinians insist that East Jerusalem to become the capital of a Palestinian state, whereas Israel today claimed the entire city of Jerusalem to be its own capital. And there too, I can't elaborate too much on this, but there is a solution to that as well, as long as the city remain open city. In fact, neither the Palestinian nor the Israelis want the city to be divided again. It will have to remain open. And so the total sum of what I am saying is that the facts on the ground point to something that, since you cannot change them in a dramatic way, short of catastrophic event, they have to be factored in. And if you factor this in, and you look at the interests of the three parties, you come to the conclusion that to end this horrifying, terrible conflict that's been going on now for 75 years, it could come to an end, provided they begin to be more realistic in looking what there is, what exists, and factor what there exists without trying to change anything dramatic, because that won't happen. And undertake seriously a process of reconciliation. That's, I emphasize that, could be 7, 8, even 10 years. That process needs to be sustained. And that's like I'm repeating myself, I know, because this is extremely important. It can be sustained only to the extent that other outside parties, that is the United States, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Germany, become the sort of the custodian to make sure that they will continue this, no matter how many hurdles, obstacles, problems may arise throughout that process. And so, to me, I'm hoping, to continue to push for this kind of solution, because as I see it, as I've been looking at it for the last several years, may well be I don't want to say practically the only practical solution that conceivably could bring an end to this conflict. Thank you very much. And I'd like to turn this to Lucy. Yes, sure. Yes, by all means. Thank you.
Thank you, Alon, and thank you to everyone who's here for the conversation in person and in line. Thank you for asking me to participate in this discussion with you and Khaled, but also thank you for this proposal and for bringing such rigor of thought and creativity and fresh eyes to a situation that I know is vexing all of us over a long period of time. I think this is the start of a very important conversation. I've mentioned a couple of you, Khaled and Alon, are aware that in my own organization, U.S. Institute of Peace, we're currently partnering on a project with Princeton University that's taking a look at this question of confederation. It has picked up interest in the discourse. Certainly, it's not a new concept, and there have been various versions of it put out over time. And I think the time definitely is ripe, for many of the reasons you talk about, for us to look at what are the possibilities it offers, but also what are some of the challenges it presents for being an answer to resolving this until now intractable conflict. And so in that spirit, I'm going to be trying to address some of those questions today. And I'm going to address some of what you've offered in your presentation and also reflect on some pieces that are in your fuller proposal that for those who may not have seen it, it's really well worth a read. It's a World Affairs Journal, I believe, the full paper where you put out your proposal. But I'm going to start with what might be the more boring way to start, which is all the ways I agree with what Alon just put forth. And I say I would largely agree with the diagnosis of the situation. The feasibility of what was once a consensus notion to some extent, certainly an international community consensus notion, and at some point a consensus around which the parties themselves have bought in to varying extents, that consensus of two states has eroded, and the idea of the feasibility of that is really a question in many people's minds. I agree also that there is no retreating, and there will not be any retreat by either side, Israeli or Palestinian, from the commitment to realizing their national aspirations on the same land. That commitment by either side is not going anywhere. I also agree, this is something you make clear in your paper and in your proposal, that the idea of a status quo is a misnomer. There is nothing static about this conflict situation. Facts on the ground move forward all the time, changing the dynamics, changing the stakes, fueling drivers of conflict. And so we cannot look at this as just, well, if we just hold in this holding pattern and figure it out later. The dynamics that you are having to address, the problem you're having to solve, is changing almost daily. I would also agree that you're looking to challenge with a pure separation model that is offered by two states, is that these two communities, as you rightly note, are so intertwined and interspersed. And this is particularly the case, of course, in the West Bank with Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. But beyond that, there is such a related interdependency on minimally the economic and security fronts that has to be addressed. I'd also agree that for as long as this conflict persists, and I think this is something, again, you point out in your paper, it's a destabilizing force in the region. It's not the destabilizing force, and it's certainly not the driver of violent extremism in the region, but it's a destabilizing force, particularly when you look at dynamics around Jerusalem and specifically around holy sites. What's sometimes called the Holy Esplanade, Haram al-Sharif, Har HaBayit to Jewish Israelis. That has the potential to be destabilizing more broadly than the immediate locale. And it also provides a rallying cry for bad faith extremist actors to exploit. Where I begin to disagree with some of the premises, I think, underlying your proposal is, and you got to this towards the end of your presentation here, the political will needed of international actors who are invested in resolving this conflict. I think you note, and rightly so in your paper, certainly, that you have, and you spoke about these actors, the US, Germany, Saudi Arabia is one example of the Arab actors, Egypt. You have this constellation of actors, outside actors, who are very committed in principle and would love to see a resolution to this conflict, certainly, and have played varying roles over the years in trying to make that happen. But what I don't think you've seen for the last number of years is a true collective sense of political will to take risks and insert themselves actively with whatever pressure needs to be brought to bear or incentives that need to be brought to bear to actually shift from what is often called, as I said, as a misnomer, the status quo. And so the question to me is, what is it? Is there something about injecting confederation as an alternative into the mix that might shift that calculus, that cost-benefit calculus by all the actors who would have to be making efforts towards this end? And so all of that leads me to a couple of questions that I hope we can get into in discussion, and concerns about what Confederation offers. And I will say, and I wanted that I actually think there's something very interesting and appealing about the notion of Confederation for the reasons that you point out. But I also think that its strength and its appeal is at the same time perhaps its weakness. I think that you note that the Confederation, and in your mind, the Confederation model you're putting forward assumes two states, and I would agree. I'm not sure you can't get to a Confederation other than between confederating two states. You can't confederate a state and a non-state. So this assumes getting to a Palestinian state at the outset. And when I think of all the reasons we have not reached that goal yet, I wonder, I'm left asking, what is it about holding out Confederation as the political horizon that helps shift the calculus, that addresses, that spurs a commitment to pursuit of two states that just a two-state political horizon alone doesn't, that addresses the drivers, including the trust deficit, which has just eroded over time the longer we've spent trying to reach a two-state end goal and not succeeding. How does it address the asymmetry of the parties in a way that makes the sustainability of a confederation model feasible? And I say all this in the context of, I think, one of the real strengths that of this proposal is this sense that this would require this transitional process of a reconciliation process, that you need to build the trust that is very much lacking in order to get to a successful confederation model. But again, if that is something that I think the field has been trying through civil society efforts, civil society engagement, we've seen recently in the last couple of years a real stepped up investment by the United States, specifically through something called the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act. This was the largest US investment in Israeli-Palestinian peace building that there has been. And a drive by organizations like the Alliance for Middle East Peace to get other international actors on board towards sort of an international fund model for that. But I think that would be a prerequisite for two states, let alone for a confederation model. And I think for a confederation model to succeed, you actually need more trust, because you're forcing two peoples who really lack trust and a sense of goodwill, or a sense that the other side is acting in good faith. You need them to be envisioning a future that's inextricably tied to each other. And so when I look at the deteriorating reality that we're talking about today, we're starting from a lower point than we were when we were working towards two states. How do we get there such that people believe in engaging with each other? And where I will end for now, when I get back to this point I made at the beginning, therefore its strength is its weakness, what I worry about with a confederal option is that confederation has an element of being whatever you might want it to be, in the sense that if you are a proponent of a separation model and two states, then this answers the call for two states without having to necessarily wrestle with what's become a very, very difficult set of factors. You know, the lack of trust, the maximalist positions on both sides that are in the ascendancy, the idea that you'd have to move large numbers of people because of the numbers of settlements that you mentioned. So with this, you can avoid having to address those issues and find a way towards two states that can incorporate that. And if you are at heart a one-state proponent, you can say, this is great. Nobody has to move. And this applies to one-state proponents on both sides for various reasons and philosophies behind it. Then, okay, so essentially we can have one state and we can call this one Palestine and call this one Israel, but we can all continue to pursue our maximalist vision and demands without really having to make the hard compromises. And so the questions I would love to wrestle with both of you on the panel is there something there I'm missing? Is there something about holding out? I would say that one of the biggest reasons that we have not gotten to a successful conclusion to this conflict to date is that certainly after, particularly when it became clear that the two-state horizon was eroding, it hasn't been filled with anything else. From the Palestinian perspective, there has been no political horizon. Is there something about holding out confederation as that ultimate political horizon that suddenly gets people on both sides, spoilers on both sides, on board with saying, sure, we can do this in a way that holding out two states as the political horizon doesn't? So I'll leave those questions on the table right now, I'm sure, and I hope we can get into more detail on beginning to answer them. And I'll hand over to Khaled.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucy, and thank you, Alon, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to end up echoing a lot of what excuse me, what we already heard from both Alon and Lucy. So, but I'll try to distinguish myself in a couple ways. First of all, I think it's really important that we're having this discussion at all. I think as it becomes clearer to more and more people that the standard classic two-state model based on territorial partition is no longer feasible, obviously it's absolutely essential that we begin looking at alternatives, not just to a two-state solution, but also within a two-state solution. And I think that's what Confederation is trying to do. It's a two-state solution in a different form, and it is both comfortable and unfamiliar in that sense. So just a couple general points and issues to raise in terms of my own approach to the issue. I think looking broadly at the conflict, which of course is not just a conflict, it's much more than that. But I would just highlight a couple points. One, and maybe I'm stating the obvious, but I sort of analytically feel like it's important to say. One, nationalism and politics matter. Neither Israelis nor Palestinians are kind of post-nationalists. There isn't a yearning by either side to sort of create a new national identity based on this shared land. And so politics matters, respectively, both the politics between them, but also their internal politics, as well as outside actors like the US and their politics. And the second point I would make is that power matters quite a lot as well. As Lucy pointed to, that there is an enormous power asymmetry between the two sides and is actually growing almost daily. And I think a point that a lot of people overlook is that this power asymmetry is in very large part what fuels the conflict, in the sense that one side has the ability to impose its way through force of arms on the ground without the need for a political settlement. And of course, the other side feels compelled to resist. That said, I think it's true. You know, Lucy asked about how does Confederation address this power asymmetry. I think that's true of any solution that we look at, whether we look at one state, two state, or hybrid models like Confederation. The reality is that any solution, as distinct from realities on the ground or as distinct from outcomes that are imposed through force, any solution will necessarily lead to a change in that power imbalance, which in practical terms means, excuse me, that one group will lose power at the expense, or one group will gain power at the expense of the other. And in this case, we're talking about Israeli Jews as the dominant group. I think any scenario that you can think of would necessarily entail a loss of power for the dominant group, Israeli Jews. That's something that we need to think about explicitly, because I think there's a tendency to try to avoid that. Well, how can we rearrange the status quo in a way where we maintain this huge power imbalance? That's sort of what the Trump plan was all about. Let's repackage it. And I think that won't work. Those aren't real solutions. And I think a solution also has to change the status quo. It has to change the very inequitable realities that exist on the ground. And if they don't, and so those are the two things that I would measure any proposal by. How does it address this power asymmetry, and how well does it deal with changing the inequities on the ground? Okay, so a couple thoughts in terms of what I like about confederation model and what I think some of the issues or risks are. So on the upside, I think its real value is in that it acknowledges that both sides have an attachment to all of the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, and it's just kind of like this problem of you know, the story of Solomon and the mother and the baby, right? So the real mother doesn't want to doesn't want to cut the baby in half, obviously, because it values it. And I think there is something to be said for that sentiment. It's very hard to diminish that attachment by both sides. I think the other advantage is that it offers creative solutions to some of the most intractable issues like settlements in Jerusalem and refugees. It gets us out of our comfort zone in thinking about this issue. I personally find it very appealing. You know, it checks a lot of the boxes, right? When looking at it. On the downside, I think it's something that's very it's much messier and harder to negotiate. There are a lot of moving parts, much more than in classic partition, right? Where you're over here, I'm over there, and the other way around. You're over there, I'm over here, and you know, you work out the security arrangements, but separation means separation, right? And so it's sort of like a divorce while you're still living together, and it feels awkward in some ways. The other the other problem I think that has is a political one. It is it's much harder to sell and market the idea. It doesn't. I think it lacks the ideological clarity that both a one-state solution and a two-state solution have. Right? It's easy to wrap your brain around, to sell it to international and domestic constituencies. You know, two states. I have my own state. I have my own flag. I don't have to worry. I'm not under someone else's domination. From the Israeli side, you know, they're over there, we're over here. It's you know, or one state with equal rights, right? We can. It's morally appealing, in its clarity, at least. And I think it's hard to market in that sense. And so, on the one hand, it is very intellectually appealing. Or satisfying. On the other hand, I think it can be politically unsatisfying. There are also some real practical problems. I think part of what might make it appealing to one side is exactly what would make it unappealing to the other side, like on the issue of settlements. And I think this is also reflected in Alon's paper. You know, the idea that, well, you know, evacuating large numbers of settlements is a problem. Well, now we don't have to. That's very appealing to, obviously, the settlers themselves, but to Israelis in general, right? There's no cost involved, you know, that you would otherwise have to undertake. The political cost of uprooting these communities, that very same thing is hugely unappealing to Palestinians, right? The idea that settlers would be rewarded or that Israel, in a sense, would be rewarded for an illegal act, especially since a very large number of these settlements are built on Palestinian land. And so what about the issue of property rights? You know, will they be compensated? Will Palestinians get to live in the settlements, which are now, of course, they're not allowed to live in them? And how do you deal with the settlers with a violent history, like in what we saw recently in Hawara? I mean, these are it's very hard for Palestinians to accept the idea that some of the most violent people in the West Bank get to stay. I think Alon mentions the example of Hebron. I can't wrap my brain around Hebron. These are some of the most violent people anywhere, and the fact that they would be able to remain in the center of the city, I think, without it affecting the lives of the thousands of Palestinians who live in the area as it does now, I think is hard to wrap your brain around. So some of these issues, I think, are need to be addressed. It's not to say that there aren't solutions to them. At the end of the day, I think the real value for me, and I'm still kind of grappling with where I stand on this issue. I'm deeply conflicted on the idea of confederation. I find it very appealing, but I also have these kind of practical problems that sort of nag at me. But at the end of the day, I think the real value in looking at these models is that it forces us to think differently about both two states and one state, right? Where it might be a sort of way station, at least ideologically, in our journey toward a final resolution of some sort, and an equitable resolution. And I don't exclude the possibility of a one-state solution, because it requires, in a lot of ways, the same kind of ideological shift that's needed to undertake a confederation, right? You have people who are living together, essentially in the same space. I think Alon does a great job of demonstrating in his paper how you can't unscramble the egg, right? These are interspersed populations across the geography of Israel and Palestine, and so if they can be, if we can acclimate ourselves to the idea that they can live together in two hypothetical states, right? In a way, imaginary states, because the borders are theoretically have been erased, right? Then why can't we're just sort of one step away from imagining one state with equal rights? We're still living together, right? So that fear of the other has to be overcome either way. And so I think it's a useful exercise in that sense. I think it also helps us think differently about a two-state solution. Again, I don't take that off the table entirely either, but I think we have to completely reimagine how we think of two states. Confederation can help us do that because it allows us to think of new options for Jerusalem, for example. The idea of an open city is based on a confederal model. I mean, this was discussed at Taba and negotiations in 2001. It's an idea that I think has some appeal. And so you might have a limited kind of confederal exercise, within a limited geographic area like Jerusalem. And it allows us also, it adds to our toolkit the idea of residency rights for some Israeli settlers. I can't imagine that all 700,000 Israeli settlers would become residents in a Palestinian state, including the violent ones, including the ones who are sitting on Palestinian land. But you could create that option through the idea of residency and visitation. I think this is really important, particularly for the for Palestinian refugees who might be able to return to live in or become citizens of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, but who might also have visitation rights or residency rights even in Israel itself. I think in that sense, it opens up the toolkit and that can be useful both for a two-state solution and a one-state solution.
Okay. You know, it will be needless to say, extremely naive to suggest that any solution, regardless how perfect it might be, that does not have issues and problems, difficulties. This is specifically when you deal with a conflict such as this one. It's been going on 75 years, and some fact, you might say even more than that, going all the way to the Balfour Declaration in 1917, so more than 100 years. So, you know, Lucy and Khalid, without any question, have justification and all the issues appear. If I may, I'm going to answer their questions, and then we'll take the questions there. Yeah. Let me just quickly address some of the issues that's been raised. So, for example, there's one that Lucy raised, international actors. To what extent, that is, in my view, the two sides cannot today sit down and reach an agreement on their own. They are going to need the parties who have also vested interest in finding a solution. The United States has geostrategic interest in the region. It wants to have a solution. It supports two-state solution. Certainly Saudi Arabia, to this day, I keep saying, they would normalize relations with Israel, provided they will be first a Palestinian state. The Germany takes pretty much the same position. They acknowledge the need for a Palestinian state. That is, these four actors are critical to create the umbrella necessary to make it possible for the two parties to sit down and negotiate. So that is why they have to come to place. And my conversation with various officials from four countries, they feel very strongly that this has to be under any circumstances because of their not only interest in resolving the conflict because they care, but because they also have geostrategic interest in the region. The why Confederation could solve some of this problem? Because we said before, there's deep, profound distrust between the two sides, Israelis and Palestinians. There's hatred, there's animosity. So you need a process to reconcile that. But the Confederation, based on my conversation, they were saying, Jordan would say, we will not join unless there is a Palestinian state first. And Israelis are saying, we'll not have a confederation only with the Palestinian unless Jordan is part of that process, because that is going to create a more regional security between the three parties and continue to expand their collaboration on just about every single field. Then the question comes of the asymmetry, this between the two sides. Today, the difference between the two, Israel and the Palestinian, is massive, just about in every respect you can imagine. There's military power, economic power, name it. When I ask myself, is there any time where you can create symmetry between the two sides? That's not going to happen anytime soon. The point here is that if Israel were to agree to the creation of independent Palestinian states, that is an equalizer. That is going to be the central issue here. That is, yeah, the asymmetry will continue to exist if there is no, because today, why I rule out the possibility of one-state solution? Today, many Israelis from the right of center will tell you, we have already one-state solution, but there are two laws. The Palestinians live under martial law, under military rules. The Israelis live under different kind of rules. That is not one-state solution. This is occupation. So yes, Israel would like to have it this way. I asked Israel, do you think you can sustain that? For how much longer? It is not sustainable. So the one-state solution will not be possible only because, from the Israelis' perspective, they created a state where they want to maintain the Jewish national identity of the state under any circumstances. If they were to allow for one-state solution and give equal right, that is a democratic form of government, the Palestinian will be a majority within a decade. Just think about that. If you look at the numbers of Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Jerusalem, they will be more or less equal to the number of Jews live today in Israel. For the Israeli, this is non-starter. Non-starter. The national identity that Khalid mentioned, there's no question. The two states that is maintain the national identity of the state. That is, the Palestinian can and will maintain the national identity of the Palestinian people. And they have an identity of their own, and it should be, and it is what it is, and that they will be able to preserve it. So the Israelis, their national identity as a Jewish state will also be preserved. You go back to the 1947 the partition plan, the United Nations Security Council established a Jewish state and a Palestinian. It's been called by those names. And so the one-state solution, in my view, is inoperable. It won't work only because the Israelis in particular will not want to be ruled over time if it's going to be democracy. But if you're talking about other form of government, non-democratic form of government, well, you already have two one-state solution today, and that is not the Palestinian will accept under any circumstances. Needless to say, and Khalid and Lucy are absolutely correct in suggesting the difficulties. Khalid mentioned the idea that this is a divorce, but they are still to live together. Yes, it is a divorce in some way, but of necessity, they have no way but living together, living next to each other, because they cannot afford to buy another house. It doesn't exist. So they are going to separate in terms of nationalities, but their coexistence is not negotiable. That is, they have to coexist in one form or another, whether they can kill each other for another 75 years or live in peace from now on. So this coexistence is not something that you can negotiate. It is not one of many options. It's the only option. It exists and it cannot be changed. The question is, how do you want to coexist? That's the question. And finally, the settlement, during the many negotiations in the past, the Palestinians agreed that the large blocks of settlement along the 1967 border will stay in place against land swap. In fact, in 2007 and 8, when Olmert was negotiating, almost reached an agreement. One of the disagreement was the percentage of the land swap. They did not agree on the percentage. Olmert demanded 6 or 7%. Abbas said no more than 2.5 something percentage point, because all these settlements, the land mass that they occupy really is not more than 4 or 5% of the entire West Bank. But I want to repeat something I said earlier. The many scattered tiny settlements throughout the West Bank, these are the ones that can be relocated, not the major blocks. And those number of settlers in all of these settlements is 80,000 out of nearly 750,000 total of settlers. And to that, the Palestinians, as I said, agreed before, and they have not changed their mind in terms of, because they know one thing. These 3 blocks of settlement are not going to go anywhere. They're going to have to stay there. Many of them have become like small cities for that matter. So there will be difficulties here. There will be issues here. There's no question about it. But what I'm saying is we've got to start someplace. Someplace that has some promise. That's the whole idea. To suggest there will be no problem, that would be terribly mistaken. There will be a problem. There will be issues. But emphasizing one thing, process of reconciliation that will take 5, 6, 7 years, as long as the Palestinians know from the onset that in the end of the process, they're going to be independent Palestinian state, and to monitor that where the 4 major foreign powers players can make sure to monitor to make sure it's existent. And there is also incentive, disincentive, for example, for the normalization of relations between Israel and other Arab countries. There are all kinds of incentive that can also be provided to both sides to make sure that they want to adhere to any kind of an agreement that they have on the outset. We can elaborate on this a great deal more, but I don't want to take any more time as far as it's concerned. Ahmed? Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thanks all of you. Appreciate your thoughtful views. A few points very related, and I'd just love to hear a response. The Confederation thing for me, it just seems like the perfect thing for someone like Netanyahu and people who think like him, and he has a lot of support to say, oh, look, we're negotiating and we're going to give the Palestinians something. They'll say that publicly, they'll say that to us in America, but then they'll do the opposite. It's a perfect vehicle to give lip service to the idea of working with the Palestinians while keeping full control. And so I think that's the big weakness with the Confederation idea. And there's 3 main problems that I think people don't say out loud often enough. But one is that with the exception of Olmert, and Netanyahu would have undone the agreement when he came to power anyway, but with the exception of Olmert, there has not been a good faith negotiator on the Israeli side between the 2 parties when they've been engaging in negotiations. Netanyahu sought to undermine Oslo in the 90s, and the way they're building settlements now is designed to prevent the establishment of any Palestinian state. That's deliberately the reason they're building them the way they are. So there's not a good faith partner on the Israeli side right now. Abbas has been a good faith partner, and his own people hate him for that. He literally has lost almost all his support because he has upheld the security arrangements with Israel. So you have the Palestinian people who, if they actually had a state, most of them, or close to most of them, would actually want what they say is the one-state solution. They want everything back from 47. They don't want two states based on 67 borders. The Abbas and the PA maybe, but that's not what the people's actual position is. So from the Israeli perspective, how you promise them that the new Palestine state that they actually do not want to have on their border doesn't ask for more or attack them or whatever. So you have the Palestinians who don't necessarily, the population want a two-state solution. They want the one-state solution. Then you have the Israelis who don't want a Palestine state called Palestine next to them that's free and sovereign. They want to have the ability to go in with their security forces. They don't want any militarized Palestinian state, and that's a no state at all if they can just go in whenever. And then you have the demographics in Israel where there's no more left, and the people that are having the most kids are these right-wing, very religious, very backwards-looking settler types. And if the Israeli left is where it is now, and it's not going to grow, and we look at what this government's doing now, what it may succeed in doing, I'm just despairing. I'm looking at these dynamics together, and we're trying to talk about confidence building. I just don't see how that could happen. You would have to have, and I'm almost done, you'd have to have what could have happened after the Gaza withdrawal. They would have worked with Abbas. They would have built him up as a credible partner. They would have rewarded his security cooperation. That hasn't happened for about 20 years. And if it hasn't happened for the past 20 years, how are we going to get to that now when the Israelis can still say, oh, we're willing to negotiate if they don't, and they do this kind of kabuki thing where the settlements keep growing. And it's harder and harder and harder every time that that demographic shifts in Israel's favor. So anyway, sorry. That was a little too long.
We go one person in because there are too many questions at the same time.
No, we can go first.
We respond to the gentleman.
Yes, go ahead, go ahead, yes.
Would you like?
I'd love to hear all yours.
Yeah.
So there are some things you said that I would agree with, or others I might characterize differently and would disagree with. But I think I will start with one of the points that you made that is and that is where the publics are at on both sides. And I made mention in my initial remarks that you have this growth. I think I may mention my initial remarks, growth on both sides of those with maximalist positions. And I don't necessarily see as synonymous maximalist positions with violent spoilers or extremists, right? There are those who are maximalists. There are those who are within the maximalist camp who are violent spoilers and violent extremists on both sides. But I think the maximalist position, that is those that say we'd like all of the land. Those numbers are rising on both sides. And in fact, we at USIP in partnership with Alliance for Middle East Peace a few years ago now, in 2020, we polled youth populations on both sides at the 15 to 21-year-olds. The poll was conducted by Khalil Shakaki and Daria Shendlin. They have been polling, as many of you may be familiar, for years. So I think sort of in the ages of 18, maybe to 21 up. This was sort of taking this younger cohort just to get a sense of where are the attitudes of this, as people always call it, the up and coming generation. And it probably won't surprise many of you that the younger generation attitudes here are harder line than their parents and their grandparents. And there is much more of an embrace on both sides of a maximalist zero sum. It's mine or it's yours. Sort of the dynamic Khaled was talking about before, that anything that you gain is to my detriment. So again, classic zero sum. That said, again, polling has its limitations, but I have still, what I construe from the various polling we've seen over many years, these populations, is a couple of things. One, and particularly when these polls have been combined with focus groups, one, when people are answering the question that they've been asked ad nauseum, do you support two states? Do you support one state? And we've seen those numbers for two-state decline. When you focus group on this, a lot of those people don't actually understand what they're answering about. What are the contours that we're talking about when we say, sure, we support two states, or sure, we'd like one state? And all the more so as confederation has been added to those questions over time, people don't know. And so this is the value of a paper, the plan like Alon's, that's beginning to put some meat on the bones of, well, what does that actually look like? But putting all these options out on the table, you have huge rise for support for zero-sum denial of the other's attachment to the land type positions, but you end up still with often a plurality on both sides of support for, as opposed to all the other alternatives. Two-state is probably ultimately the best one. So I think what you are pointing to in your comments, though, is this lack of, particularly on the Palestinian side, a disconnect between the publics and their leadership, absolutely no faith in their leadership and ability. Again, you've got a fragmented leadership, Palestinian leadership, and the West Bank, huge legitimacy crisis for the West Bank leadership. And you're right, partly because of what has been seen as an ineffective pursuit and construed as just collaboration and with Israel and providing Israel with security, but not achieving any gains. But I think that this is where we get to, I think you construed it as, you haven't had good faith, you only had good faith with Olmert, but on the Palestinian with Abbas. I would argue maybe not just Olmert could be in that category. I would also argue that I think Abbas has absolutely been a partner, and I think the Israeli. No, I know, but a good faith and certainly commitment to sort of a non-violent pursuit and holding to the goal of two states, but I think a reluctance along the way. I think there's been a reluctance on both sides as well, and challenges of feeling that they have the buy-in to prepare their publics and make some hard decisions. I think that's been a challenge, I would argue, on both sides as well. And so to take this back to sort of the topic of the conversation, I think all these challenges exist with trying to get to two states. My question is there something about changing the endgame to confederation that changes those dynamics? And I think that's what we're wrestling.
Do you want to get his question first?
Oh, I was
and
going
then
to respond to.
Oh, by all means, you can. Yeah.
Just very quick, just very quickly, because I think you exactly hit on kind of the risks that we were alluding to with this sort of a situation, or with this sort of a model of confederation, and that's why the key question is, to me, how does any given model address that power asymmetry? And I think it really depends on the terms. The outcome will obviously depend on the very specific terms that are agreed to on security, what is joint, what is individual, on settlements. Will all settlements stay? Will some go? And what kind of transitional arrangements are put in place? And ultimately, I think it really, this is why, and to Alon's credit, he talks a lot about in the paper about reconciliation. And I think a huge part of the success of this model would depend on a real transitional justice process, something along the lines of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so that would have to be laid out before you could actually sell it to local constituencies, right? Because people would need to know that past injustices will be addressed, that the existing asymmetry is going to be addressed. And so the process matters a lot in that sense. And this is why I was saying it's so much harder to negotiate. There's so many more moving parts. And so the classic approach that the US in particular has taken of constructive ambiguity, let's agree on a framework for peace, and then we'll flesh out the details later. That kind of Osloistic and Kissingerian approach to the issue won't work in this, right? You can't agree on a framework for confederation and then leave the details later. You have to work out the details because, but again, we're back to where we started. That's what makes it so hard to negotiate.
You want to respond?
Yeah, here actually, you're right. It's very important to define what you mean by confederation. Define what you mean. Define what you mean by confederation. Okay, the confederation also has to bring all players, stakeholders, particularly USA. So actually, the problem here is here, USA, with the influence of APEC over the Congress and over the president. So actually, if we can, or I recommend, have open talk with APEC. This actually, you start with here, actually, have open communication with them. This is our proposal. We are supportive of the continuation of the state of Israel and securing its borders, because this is one of the objectives of the US national interests. You know that we have here a commission of US national interest, right? And the security of Israel is number 1 or 2 in this American national interest. So, yeah, and after that, we'll move to other players.
Right. If I may, you asked for by definition, the way I define the confederation is defined as voluntary association of independent state that to secure some common purpose, agree to certain limitations on their freedom of action, and establish some joint machinery of consultation or deliberation that is by agreement mutually agreed upon between the parties. That is what we're talking about. So, but maintaining the integrity of independent state. That is, they do not compromise their national, they do not compromise, but they cooperate, for example, on national security. They have to cooperate because the status of Jerusalem, it is what it is. They need to cooperate. They have to continue that kind of cooperation. I just want to mention when you talk about AIPAC, well, I'm not exactly fond of AIPAC, I must say.
But
let me just say, AIPAC is whatever Israeli government does, be that left government, central government, AIPAC will go along with whatever Israelis really. Occasionally behind the scene, they may have some kind of discussion. I think the idea, actually, I approach different organization, which is J Street. And J Streets are extremely, and I repeat, extremely interested in the concept because they are far more in tune to what's really going on. And it is, contrary to what AIPAC stands for. But this J Street is it's very respected. They stand for two-state solution. They needed a framework. And I had extensive conversation with them on the subject. So that's what I just want to impart with you.
Maybe we'll move to other questions.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I really appreciate the on-the-ground, reality-based perspective. I appreciate the comment, particularly about Hebron, hell on earth. It seems to me that after the discussion of what the realities on the ground are, we start getting into pie in the sky, what could be, what should be, what ought to be, which has been discussed now for 3/4 of a century. It seems to me that the reality is that Israel wants an increasing larger Jewish state, and that they want to push out the Arabs, Christians as well as Muslims, who have no other place to go except to be refugees in other countries. What would the boundaries of a Palestinian state look like? Where would that be? If Israel is not willing to really be a democracy with equal rights for all, and it's not, it is apartheid, then what would a Palestinian state look like? Where would it be, realistically speaking? Thank you.
No, I think, and if you.
I'll try and address just a couple of comments that and questions from your question and in your question as well. I think that the premise of the conversation today and the jumping off point was Alon's confederation model, and this is a model, the sort of the thinking behind a confederation model has come, has really been given impetus, as I think we sort of discussed and laid out here, because people are despairing of this question of can we achieve two states? There was, as I've mentioned, there was what one might call a consensus position for a while, and by consensus I'm referring to sort of when we talk about this term, the international community, those stakeholders who've been engaged in trying to bring that about. We've mentioned some of them, and the parties, as I said at the beginning, that the way to bring about a sustainable, peaceful solution would be to have two separate national entities. Israel as a state for the Jewish people, and Palestine as a state for the Palestinian people. That was the premise of the two-state solution. It goes back to the 1947 petition plan. Now at that time again, and we didn't get to this, it was not actually laid out as, it was the petition plan lists a Jewish state and an Arab state is how it is laid out in the petition plan. But the idea was a two-state solution. And again, we didn't get to this, but the component of Jordan, I think what would raise questions and concerns for Jordan about the confederation is I think that Jordan has always had the concern because of the demographics that you laid out with the majority Palestinian population. Jordan does not want to be an alternative, as was sometimes a sort of right-wing Israeli position of Jordan is Palestine. It's an Arab state, but there already is a state for the Palestinians. So I think for Jordan, for a model of confederation, it would have to be very, very clear that this was three separate distinct states and that these symmetry issues would have to be laid out. But again, I think that this is what this conversation is trying to get to. How do you get to how do you first get to two very clearly defined states? And we haven't been able to accomplish it so far as an international community pursuing a two-state model. And so does this answer the call for the challenges? And I think, again, Khaled and I have raised some of the concerns about you do have to address that asymmetry first, because otherwise, I was saying before discussion here, we kept hearing this term snapback in relation to the Iran deal. Sort of what happens, how do you return to if something is not working, how do you get back in the situation of confederation? Is the symmetry issue addressed such that if there's a security crisis, what's the reversion point from a confederation? Do you revert to two states living side by side, or do you end up reverting to status quo where Israel is able to go in because it's worried about security again, and then you have this situation right now? So I think all of these are things that would have to be figured out in the implementation. On your question about engaging, whether it's AIPAC or others, I mean, I think everybody in any conflict resolution situation, any vested and influential audience, a stakeholder should be consulted and engaged. And I think the field is much more complex. I mean, I think that there are several interest groups all around and actors who have influence on this conflict. and the trajectory of this conflict that goes beyond certainly just AIPAC or just J Street, and many others who I think just have to be engaged and part of this process. I would include in that, you were mentioning the growth of religious communities. I mean, I think that one of the values I see in civil society work over the last number of years, investment in peace building organizations, is that one of the challenges that people have commented on was that what was called the so-called peace camp for many years on both sides was a camp perhaps divorced from and not representative of both societies, and it was tended to be secular, left wing, and that defines differently on both sides. But with the growth on both sides of communities with strong religious attachments and approach to this issue from religious sensibilities, how do you engage? Do you just you can't ignore those communities, and how do you engage constructively and engage people across a spectrum of views to get to a kind of solution? And I think probably one of the questions is, does Confederation allow, in your reconciliation process, does that allow that to happen?
Before, now I'm going to just, because,
No, you go ahead.
Okay, were you going to address?
because it's being responded. Pardon?
Are you going to address my question?
The point, your question, if you go back and you say the Israelis want all of the land, the Palestinians also would like to have it all. This is the whole issue here. That is, there are demands today, both are raising, that cannot be met in today's situation. The idea behind what we are presenting here is how you attain a breakthrough. How do you change minds? How do you go about it? Knowing one thing. That's why we established a prerequisite. The prerequisite is a independent Palestinian state. This is not something that the Palestinians are going to give up on. It will never happen. It will never happen. Whether the Israelis like it or not, it will never happen.
You said this, that might, yes.
Yeah. So borders have been discussed many times in various negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians along the 1967 borders, with the exception of the settlements. There will be some land swap, 5-6% of the land. This has been talked about extensively in the past. That's not going to change. So the difficulties are embedded into this horrible conflict that's been going on for so long. That's just a fact. The whole idea is, do we sit and say it didn't happen, then it's not going to ever happen again? Well, that is giving up. Well, I'm not prepared to give up. I don't think that millions of people like me are not prepared to give up. It's a solution to this horrifying conflict that it is destroying both people, as a matter of fact. I'd like to say one word on that, but please, Khaled, if you want to add something, I just want to finalize with myself.
I mean, I would just say that part of both the problem and an asset of the Confederation model is that it has a bit of an identity crisis, right? It can take any number of different forms, from sort of repackaging the status quo to something entirely different that fundamentally challenges the status quo. But it would take a lot of negotiating, a lot of attention to detail, and so the question then becomes, if you're going to undertake all of this effort in order to negotiate a boundary, and then maybe even evacuate some settlements, and all of the kind of political and economic costs associated with that, and do all of the things that you would have to do to reach a hard border two-state solution, and then on top of that have to agree more internal arrangements about security, and is it worth it, right? I mean, does it get to a point where you say the costs outweigh, the political costs outweigh the presumed benefit? The benefit may be amazing if you could actually get agreement on all of these details of how you're going to share sovereignty and share control and share security and share holy places. And so if the last 30 years is any indication, then it doesn't look good for a confederal model. And so it would fundamentally require this change in attitude. And so the question is, how do you start to affect that change in order to get to a place where the mindsets can adapt to a confederation model that would work.
Thank you so much. I know we are obviously running out of time. I'm sorry. So let me just say a couple of things and a couple more minutes. You know, you have to be in the West Bank to see the people, and have to go to Israel and see what's really happening. I just want to think in those terms. 90% of all living Palestinian today, 90% were born under occupation. 90%. 80% of Israelis were born as an occupying power. So the poison of occupation flows in the vein of just about 9 out of 10 Palestinians. That is not sustainable. It cannot happen. It cannot continue. And it is also destroying the character of Israel as we know it. Today, when a Palestinian think of an Israeli, they think of an Israeli soldier with a machine gun who is about to come and raid them during the night. And the Israelis think of the Palestinian as a terrorist. That kind of mindset must be changed. It will have to change, or else they will continue to kill each other for another 100 years. That is not acceptable. So however we look at this proposal with all of its problems and issues embedded in it, and it's certainly complicated, we've got to start someplace. And the people telling me, well, this is not the right time. When is the right time? If there is a right time, now it's the right time, because it is about to explode. But to suggest, for example, that the current Israeli government or Abbas are going to sit down and be able to talk about this, something of this sort, that's a pipe dream. This Netanyahu government will not do so. Nor Abbas is able to deliver the kind of concession also necessary. That won't happen. So this is very complicated, but we've got to start a conversation. Albeit these governments are sitting there. We've got to start that conversation. That is what this is all about. If we don't start, there will be no end to this conflict. And that's, with all its problem with the proposal, with all of its difficulty, it's a starting point, notwithstanding the horrifying, the very many scores of difficulties, as Khalid rightfully enumerated, as well as Lucy. So that's where we're coming from. I want to thank you, Lucy, for your wonderful contribution. I'm really grateful to you. And Khalid, most grateful to you for your contribution. And thank you all for listening to this.
Thank you for